One of the more perverse symptoms of white supremacy is that we are constantly seeking approval and validation from black people and other racialized groups. Welcome to the Bell Hooks Book Club! The thing about systems of oppression, right, is that being at the top of a violent hierarchy doesn't necessarily bring feelings of security or safety. Oppressive classes often demonstrate a deep sense of anxiety and fear and fragility. This is partly because benefiting from an unjust hierarchy, often in ways that we as individuals are not actually in control of, tends to create a sense of guilt and unease that a lot of us just don't really know what to do with. And there are many different ways that people navigate that tension, one of which being to search for evidence that we are one of the good ones. We seek the validation of oppressed people because that soothes us emotionally. One of the stereotypes of black womanhood pushed by white Americans at the time of the transatlantic slave trade was that of the mammy figure. And this stereotype actually highlights the white desire for black validation. Her greatest virtue was, of course, her love for white folk, whom she willingly and passively served. The mammy image was portrayed with affection by whites because it epitomized the ultimate sexist, racist vision of ideal black womanhood: complete submission to the will of whites. In a sense, whites created in the mammy figure a black woman who embodied solely those characteristics they as colonizers wished to exploit. They saw her as the embodiment of woman, as a passive nurturer, a mother figure who gave all without expectation of return, who not only acknowledged her inferiority to whites, but who loved them. The mammy as portrayed by whites poses no threat to the existing white patriarchal social order, for she totally submits to the white racist regime. Yes, this is about submission, but it's also about intimacy. The mammy figure was, and is, a fantasy of white people. A loyal, soothing black woman who loves her servitude, feels maternally towards white people, and asks nothing for herself. Most importantly, she reassures white people that black people do not resent their oppression, or at least the kind ones don't. This is basically an emotional anesthetic. And there are other stereotypes pushed in modern pop culture that fulfill a similar function. The magical N-word trope places a black character who may or may not have mystical powers into a story solely to guide the white protagonist in their journey of personal growth. They exist to validate the white character's goodness and help them overcome internal tension. You could say that this is a spiritualized version of the mammy's function. While the magical N-word might not be a literal servant, they are ultimately in spiritual servitude to the white protagonist. And then you have the black best friend trope. This is a little broader and more varied, but many times the black best friend functions as an emotional support system for the white protagonist. They are wise but non-threatening, they are patient and forgiving, they are non-competitive, especially romantically because they're often paired off with another black character, they are loyal and affirming, and often perform the function of boosting courage or giving approval. Of all the tropes mentioned so far, this is the one with the most egalitarian form of intimacy in the dynamic, their best friends. And this dynamic alone helps to frame the white protagonist as a good person because they have earned the trust and intimacy of a black peer. Something I have heard black women in particular talk about is the way in which white women often try and push or force intimacy with them. It seems we sometimes display a desperation for that validation and approval, which leads to us objectifying black women because we treat them as symbols for our own goodness. Within feminism specifically, we might try and use the idea of shared oppression and a sisterhood to try and gain that intimacy. Now, some of you might be asking, Ellie, how do we know you're not trying to get this validation? How do we know that your motivation for making this series isn't to gain the approval of black people and soothe yourself? Perhaps you're now expecting me to give you evidence for why that is not the case, but I think to do so would be missing the point. While I am not consciously aware of that being my motivation, I can't guarantee that that hunger for black validation isn't baked into my unconscious and isn't somewhat influencing my behaviour. There are two ways in which I could really easily let myself off the hook in terms of doing my due diligence here. I could let that idea completely paralyse me and say, I'm not going to talk about racism at all, just in case I'm validation seeking. And that would of course mean that I would be leaving the burden of doing that work on the shoulders of those who experience racism. Or I could try and convince myself and you that there is no way that validation seeking is part of my motivation. But really that would just be self-soothing, and that would prevent me from actually addressing the issue within myself. So I think the most sensible thing to do is to assume that that desire for black validation is there, but not let that intimidate me because I can put in mitigating steps against it. When I decided I was going to cover this book, I did not just jump into this process. I did a lot of thinking in advance about how I was going to go about this, and part of that thinking was acknowledging and confronting the fact that it would be very easy for me to get swept up in the validation, swept up in the good feeling of having approval from black people engaging with the content. So to mitigate that, I've set certain boundaries for myself to help reduce the risk of falling into that validation seeking behaviour. Boundaries in terms of what subjects I will and will not discuss and how I engage with comments, and also just refraining from making any content from an emotionally charged place, because those are the moments where our unconscious desires tend to do a lot more of the driving when we're operating from a place of emotional intensity. These are some of the safeguards that I've put in place so that I can do this work of sharing the value of bell hooks. Because I do think it's important that a greater diversity of people take on that social responsibility. I don't think it should just be on the shoulders of Black people to share the words of this author. And within my broader facilitation work, this is an approach that I encourage all members of dominant groups to take. Instead of trying to prove that you are one of the good ones, just assume that you have some baggage, because we all do. No matter who we are, we all have conditioning, and put in mitigating steps against that baggage. When we do that, engaging with this kind of work and broadening our practice becomes less intimidating. You'll never get rid of the desire to be perceived as a good person. That's very natural, but you can find ways to make the work you are doing a greater priority than how you are perceived.
Hello everyone, I hope you are all fine. Welcome to Black White Commentary. I am your host Brian, and today we are going to have a deeper discussion on matters of white validation from the Black community. And we realize that maybe these people have been fooling us, because every now and then they tend to look for validation from the Black community. Maybe not all of them, but a few individuals who have been seeking validation from the Black community. That question gets to be talked about a lot online, but it can easily slip into overgeneralization, because not all white people seek validation from the Black community. We realize that seeking validation is usually about wanting acceptance, credibility, or cultural legitimacy in spaces where Black culture holds strong influence. It becomes problematic when it is superficial, extractive, or ignores the inequalities behind that influence. From the past, the white community has wanted the validation from the Black community. Maybe it's because of the systems that they have placed in countries like United States of America, Europe, and therefore these systems, it works for them, but it's not working for the Black community, and therefore they need to look for acceptance from this Black community, because the Black community has always been oppressed from this white community, and therefore acceptance is one of the things they want to look for from the Black community, because these systems has never worked for the Black community, and therefore looking for credibility, looking for validation from the Black community is one of the things that they look for. Therefore, stay tuned.
It's interesting how we white people often navigate white supremacy by seeking emotional validation from Black people and other racialized groups. Being at the top of any unjust hierarchy can actually create a lot of emotional instability, and many of us try and soothe this by seeking approval so that we can see ourselves as one of the good ones. Something Bell Hooks highlights is the stereotype of the mammy, a fantasy of a loyal, comforting Black woman who reassures white people that they are loved and they are absolved. Modern tropes like the magical N-word or the Black best friend serve a similar purpose. They exist to affirm the goodness of the white protagonist. Black women have often described to me how white women they interact with push for immediate intimacy with them, and those of us in feminist spaces have a tendency towards using ideas of sisterhood to gain approval, rather than doing genuine relational work. And for those of us who choose to talk publicly about racism like myself, I do think it's sensible to assume that this desire for Black validation is at least somewhat baked into our psyche. But the solution to that is not to avoid doing the work and leave the burden of that on everyone else's shoulders, nor is it to insist that we are free of these impulses. By instead just assuming and accepting that this desire is probably there, we can then put safeguards in place to mitigate the risk of it leading our behaviour. We can set boundaries around what we discuss, how we engage, and how we manage our emotions. Anyone in a dominant group can do this, and there's something both liberating and grounding about it. Rather than trying to prove that we are morally pure, it's much more practical to just accept that we all carry conditioning and mitigate the risks of that conditioning. This is what enables us to prioritise the work over the desire to be seen as good or cool.
From the videos, you realize that issues like sexism, racial tension, and cultural imitations aren't separate problems. They are all symptoms of what is called white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And therefore, a system where race, gender, and class power are intertwined. Some of the key things that come out from the validations where white people want validation from the Black community, you realize that there is intersectionality. Black women face racism and sexism. Black men face racialized masculinity pressures. So sexism and anti-blackness aren't competing. They are all overlapping forces from the same system. Culture and contradiction. Black culture is widely consumed and copied, but Black people remain marginalized. People can adopt Black aesthetics, seek validation from black spaces, and want proximity to blackness without facing black struggles. We also have some patterns where a pattern of to appropriate the culture and ignore the people. There is also the aspect of internal accountability. Patriarchy exists inside black communities too. Oppression doesn't erase sexism. Liberation means fighting racism and challenging sexism and toxic idea of power and masculinity. Therefore, validation is not just a single thing of just imitation or acceptance. It's also a systemic oppression. Validation is, is intertwined in a system in the United States of America, Europe, and all over, especially in the United States of America. There is also root issue. The system teaches us what to value, what's beautiful, cool, who gets recognition versus who gets raised. Healing demands truth, accountability, and love as action, not just feeling. The bottom line is that seeking black validation is usually about wanting acceptance, credibility, or cultural legitimacy. In spaces where black culture holds strong influence, it becomes problematic when it's superficial, extractive, or ignores the inequalities behind the influence. Therefore, I believe these videos and the content at large has been helpful. Therefore, I believe you'll hit the like button, notification button, subscription button, and also put your comments on the comment section. Stay tuned to this channel. I am your host, Brian. Welcome again and again. Thank you.